Alright, so there are only so many types of questions they can ask. And you would have realised this on yesterday's practice exam. Essentially, they can be reduced down to this. You don't have this summary, that's fine, I took the slide out. There are identify, define, describe, explain, evaluate. And you might get compare and contrast. Most of them are actually quite manageable, but there are some that we need to be a little bit more precise with. So let's go through each one. This is on my classes already. Identify questions are by far the easiest. Here's an example of one that you had on yesterday's practice exam. Identify one treaty related to an ethical issue. Everyone got this mark. It's a 1-mark question. You can get a question which is identify one TNC you have studied. 1 mark. They throw in those easy questions because they want some people to still be able to get some marks. So this is by far the easiest. Just make sure that it matches with the question. However, there are often subsequent questions below it that relate to the identify. So part B might be explain how your answer to part A, blah, 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 or evaluate your answer to part A. So pick what you put in the identify section, pick the one that you can write the most about. If it's about arms control and disarmament, if the NPT is the one you can write the most about, pick the Non-Proliferation Treaty. If you get one like identify one institution of global governance, I think most people would probably pick the UN. Because if the next 3 questions are on your first answer and you pick the WTO, you might struggle to elaborate on the WTO in the next 3 questions. So pick the one you can write the most about. Choose wisely. And yeah, for something as simple as this, write the full thing. I think somebody wrote the 1967 protocols, and I've actually marked it wrong. Because there are lots of different protocols. There are hundreds of different protocols. So write down the full name of the treaty. It's a 1-mark question. It takes you about 2 or 3 more seconds to write the full name. Well, someone to this question, their answer was 1967 protocols. And I've marked it wrong, so I don't know what the protocols are. So for a simple 1-mark question, write the full thing. That's the easiest thing you'll do. Girls? Yeah? I don't think so. No. She wants to show where New Zealand is. We can show where Indonesia is. The second easiest question you'll get, definition. They'll always be 2 marks, and this is just like we've done all year. The first mark is defining the term, the second mark is your example.
It would be 3 marks.
Define?
Yeah.
Or describe?
No, define. Those are defined. Like define international.
It's 2.
Or something in one of the practice ones.
Oh, one of the practice ones that might have been, but not from the VCAR ones.
So they'll always be.
Yeah, they'll always be 2. Now, in some ways it doesn't matter because our answers are going to be worth 3. You can actually get 2 marks for defining. A really good definition is worth 2, but I don't care if you're writing the best definition of all time, I still want an example there.
Wait, is a really good definition still can be 1 sentence? Right?
Yes, and I've got an example here where, no, I don't. You still want your definition to be your first sentence as good as possible. It might end up taking up all the space, but you're still going to put an example. We're having an example with everything. And it was good at the practice exams I've marked so far. Most of them have had examples with everything, but let's get back in that frame of mind, examples for every single question.
Would the study design definitions be the ones that count for 2 marks?
They would be 2 on the spot, yeah. You're going to have an example anyway, though. So even if you miss a few words, or even if you do your own definition off the top of your head, like the ones on the wall here, very few of these are study design ones. They're the ones I've put together. They're still pretty close to 2. But if an assessor is erring, not sure whether it's 2, your example will definitely push into 2. Lottie?
There was a question on the practice exam that was like, identify an example of international cooperation. And I said coalition with willing, and then I wrote, the states working together. Is the coalition the 1 mark, or that would be like a half?
An example alone can rarely get full marks. It needs to be either explained and linked back to the idea of international cooperation. So somewhere in there you'd have to say, this is an example of international cooperation because it involves many actors working together to achieve a common goal. And that is like a definition. Girls, this is pretty important and I want to get through all this in about 20 minutes. Yeah, if it's just identify one example, coalition of the willing. Yeah. If it's 1 mark and it's just identify, you just list. It's like a list. It's almost list 1.
But if it said define an example,
Then we're doing this. Define.
Could you have literally put any example of like state international cooperation, even though in that page you're talking about the Asia Pacific?
No, that was from area of study 4, that one. Because international cooperation, that term comes from our 4th area of study crises. So anything can go in crises.
So if I said the schools program with Australia and Indonesia working together,
It has to be 3 or more actors, international cooperation. 3 or more actors.
Oh, I don't.
I had a big fight with them last year when we were marking that particular question because they redefined the term cooperation, but that's another debate. I want to make a point here about your example.
Are you serious?
Anna, you've not stopped talking. I hope. Here are 3 different ways to use an example. The first one is the weakest. Now, it's better than nothing, but it's the weakest. You can tell it's just been dropped in there. The second one is more detailed, and the third one's the best one because it links back, it's more detailed, links back to the actual term. So the point I'm making is actually link your example back to the defining term. It's only going to take you half a dozen more words. It makes the example more meaningful. These are our easiest questions, defined questions. An example which is linked back to the defined term is going to guarantee you the marks. So we don't want to lose any small marks because of laziness. Okay. Oh, here's another example of that. This is on the PowerPoint. Yeah. An example is the coalition of the willing, which involves over 30 actors working together to change the Iraq regime. So the working together links back to the term international cooperation.
Can that be over any area of study? Like, can those ones be anywhere? Like, would they be like paramedical facilities?
Well, what do you mean? No, they'll only be from their area. So international cooperation will only be in area of study 4. And the clues for which defining terms are on the back of each of these. Really, you can use anything in any section as examples. The only examples that have to be specific are from Indonesia. So if you get a defined question for this unit, your examples have to come from the Asia Pacific region, and our examples are all going to be Indonesia examples. They're the only ones where your example has to be from one area. Everywhere else, you can pick and choose and drop your examples wherever you like. All right, describing. I think this is another one which is fairly straightforward, and we're trying to overcomplicate it. In a way, this can almost be like a dot point answer. Don't use dot points, but when you're describing something, you're simply picking the features of it. And you guys are starting to try and explain things and evaluate things in a describing question. It's just the different features of something. Detail. One way you can add more detail is by using this thing we did in embedded clauses. So this is a normal sentence. The coalition of the willing responded by invading and occupying Iraq. That's okay, but if I use an embedded clause to add information with commas, I can fatten up my describing, so to speak. So with describing, it's just providing as much detail as possible about something. It's either about a treaty, or about a global actors response, or about an IGG. An international law, a type of foreign policy. It's just detail. Don't start explaining why it is the way it is or evaluating how successful it's been. Just the detail. That's why it is one of the easier questions still. of course, you need to have that detail in your head. Stats are great, use them. And if you know years and you think they're accurate, refer to years. So in 2003, the US invaded Iraq. This was their response. It included the coalition of willing, etc.
If you said like this was their response, like they, or like if they didn't sign a treaty, like this was their response because they wanted to retain sovereignty.
Yes.
Is that still right?
That's fine, but the valuable bit is the first bit, which is
Yeah.
their response was to not sign key treaties. So that's 1 mark.
But would you get the second mark saying they wanted to retain sovereignty? Is that
No,
not relevant?
because that's you're explaining.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, you got it for the first half of the sentence. Okay, detail. Explaining. This is always about the why. It might be why an actor has done what it's done, why a treaty is successful, why a global actor is influential, why a particular type of conflict is hard to resolve. Now, they're never phrased like this. They're always phrased with explain. So explain the power of one global actor, or explain how successful one treaty has been. But you're telling me why. So this treaty has been successful because 189 states have signed it, because it encourages states to work together, because it's reduced the threat of nuclear weapons. It's also been unsuccessful because blah, 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 because blah, blah, blah. I would have no problem as a marker if someone used that exact phrasing one after another after another. If I saw because 6 times is a pretty good sign that there are 6 explaining sentences.
Can you just talk about the successes instead
Yeah.
of, like, you don't have to
Yep.
do any limitations?
Yep, absolutely. If it's only a 3 mark explain, and
Or
you're,
if it's like 6 marks, even to be like, you still have to.
I'd split it so that you can make sure that you're doing lots of explaining if you split it. Because it'd be hard to do 6 explaining sentences just about the success of something.
Yeah.
But isn't that all of this stuff?
No, because you're still explaining why it wasn't successful. So if you got the second one, 3 marks explaining why the NPT was successful, 3 marks explaining why it was limited in its success. I know it sounds a bit like an evaluate, but if you're using because, you're fine.
Do you have to split it evenly, or can you do more than 6?
We're going to get to plurals in a minute. Here, you don't need to split it at all. No, you don't need to split it evenly here.
But if it was like a 6-mark question and you're doing successes and then...
Yeah, you don't have to split it evenly, no.
Yeah.
The only place you're going to need to split it evenly is with plurals, and I've got a slide on plurals coming up when you've got 2 things mentioned in the question. Typically involves because, or as a result of, in order to. And when you make an assertion, I say this a lot on those summary sheets I just gave you, you need to explain your assertion. So if you say something like, the NPT has not been successful, that's not really explaining. You're making a statement. What comes next is the valuable bit. The NPT has not been successful because some states have not signed it. That's explaining. The Refugee Convention has been successful because it encourages states to work together to protect vulnerable people. So when you make an assertion, you have to provide evidence. That's your explaining sentence. The next thing I wanted to say about explaining questions is, I don't think there's harm in doing a little bit of describing first and then following it up with explaining. So I'll let you read through this one. Now, I think this is a good answer. We don't have hard and fast rules in global as to where exact marks come from. A lot of it is the intuition of the assessor. So this looks good and it'll either get you 2 or 3, depending on who's looking at the answer. The safer option is to just do 1 describing sentence and 2 explaining. So have a read through that one. So there's clearly more explaining in the second one. The point I'm making is, don't get too caught up with describing when it's clearly an explain question. You might need to first explain what they did. They formed attachment 88, but spend most of your time explaining why. Evaluate. This is an area where evaluating is about judging the extent to which something or someone has achieved its goals. So, evaluate how successful the UN has been in achieving its goals. Evaluate one global actor's response to terrorism. Evaluate one global actor's use of diplomacy as a foreign policy instrument. You're passing judgment. So you can come up with, it's up to you to decide how successful. And they're just a couple of sample questions. Of course, in evaluate, you first have to say what they did. So your answer will probably start with, the US's response involved the invasion of Iraq and overthrowing the Saddam Hussein regime. So you first need to tell us what they did, what they sought to achieve. They did this in order to resolve the crisis around weapons of mass destruction. So we still haven't started evaluating yet. But of course, if we're going to judge something according to what it seeks to achieve, we've first got to establish what it seeks to achieve. And then lastly, the extent to which they were successful or unsuccessful. So we're judging things according to what they sought to achieve. And the same goes for IGGs. You can't hold the WTO accountable for something it didn't seek to achieve. It seeks to liberalise trade. So you're judging it according to how successfully it promotes free trade. And what are we going to have after this evaluating? What's our next sentence going to be?
Limitation.
Yes, we're doing evaluate and then limitations. That's both there. But with every question, what are we using? Examples. Use them to support what you're saying. You've got so many examples from throughout this course, and we're going to go over our examples in the next few lessons, and I'm just going to tell you which ones are the best ones. But use the examples you've got. Yes?
That question where it said, explain the impact of the international law or treaty.
Yes.
Is that like an evaluate question? The one
Which one?
The question in the practice
Explain the
impact. Is that like an evaluate?
It is. It's a little similar, yeah. Because you...
So we did the limitations of it?
Yeah. It's a little tricky because they put the word impact in there. So yeah, you need to establish to what extent they've had an impact.
Okay.
So it was on the border of both. So evaluate questions, we're going to be practicing these next 2 weeks. Plurals. The clue is in the question. The clue will always be in the question. If you've got a plural, more than one, so you've got singular, one, plural, more than one. It's always there with S's. Compare and contrast the responses. That's the answer is going to have 2 parts. Responses. Explain how one state has used foreign policy instruments. 2 instruments. Or more. You could have 3 if you like. Describe how global actors. This seems like a really small basic thing, but I can't tell you how many students will just write about one thing. And it's an innocent mistake to make. You're nervous, you just want to start writing, you fill a whole page about the UN and you move on. But the question is clearly actors, 2. So anytime you see a plural, circle it, make a point, 2 or more. Now if they actually say only 2, of course you can only write about 2. But these don't distinguish 2. So, the second one, explain how one state has used foreign policy instruments. You could do 2 marks about diplomacy as a foreign policy instrument, 2 marks on trade, 2 marks on aid. Make your job easier. You don't need to write a whole page just about diplomacy. So plurals, make sure you split it. Now one we already know is going to be a plural is ethical debates. It's always going to be debates, plural. You're never going to get ethical debate. So anytime you see an S, you know your response is going to be split in half or into thirds. Oh, and the point I'm making here is just if it's worth 8 marks, split it 4 and 4. The US's response to the Iraq War, the UN's response, 4 marks on each. If it's 7, split it 4 and 3, etc.
What was the thing you said before splitting?
If it's a plural, so if you know the question is asking you for 2 things and it's worth 6 marks, then the assessors will definitely told you can get a maximum of 3 marks for one, a maximum of 3 marks for the other. So you just split your attention. And make it easier for whoever is reading your response to see when you move on to the second half of your response by signposting. So, one global actor's use of power has been blah, 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 blah. A second example of a global actor using power has been. Use signposts. One foreign policy instrument used by Indonesia has been, and then you write for 3 marks. A second use of foreign policy instrument has been. Now you're doing this actually pretty well. I made this PowerPoint about a week ago. This was done pretty well so far, especially in the ethical debates questions. But I just want to reiterate it because it's the easier you can make it, the better. Ethical debates. Now, I thought this would be an issue, but the ones I've read, I've just finished the ethical debates page this morning, and they're pretty good. So I don't want to make too big a deal, except that it's debates. It's 2 parts of one debate. They're almost always opposites. So do we protect refugees or do we ensure security of the state? Can a state build nuclear weapons to maximise their security or are there threats from proliferation? They're almost always opposite debates, and this is one way to answer it, which is you describe one side of the debate, you use a theory to explain it, and then an example. And this is the way lots of them have been coming in, and they tend to work the best. Oh yeah, yeah. You're using your example to fatten up what you're saying about that side of the debate. So if you're talking about the rights of refugees, of course you're going to talk about Australia, how we seek to protect the rights of refugees we take in 20,000 a year.
Okay, so kind of like a really broad, like,
Yeah, but it's...
because like, you know how like, I say
Girls.
of like border security and how it's like, you know, we have to protect things like ourselves from like say terrorism or something.
Yep.
It's not an example.
That's not an example yet, but we want one, yeah. Australia seeks to protect its borders by having a particular migration program which... Yep. Again, just one thing. I'm going to say this again, signposts. On the one hand, commentators suggest that we should protect the rights of refugees, blah, 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 blah. On the other hand, some people believe that they are a threat to security. And I've got a few different ones. One argument is that states should be allowed to develop nuclear weapons to defend themselves. Another view suggests that weapons are a threat. Use the signposts, and as you're practicing this section of your subject reader, because there's a pretty big section on it, use the signposts to distinguish between 2 different arguments. Melissa, you had a question? Beg pardon? That's true. The mechanisms of threat reduction and... we will do them very briefly. There's a whole lesson on ethical debates because I want us to be clear on them. The trick with all the debates is to just change the content we've done to match the debate. They're really broad debates and they're very similar. So yeah, we will go over each of them and there's a little summary activity.
Do they need to have a nice flow? Because mine, for like the refugee, I was just like, oh, you know, terrorist health risks, oh, they take our jobs, oh, blah, blah, blah.
No, that's fine. No, as long as, I mean, I'd prefer it if you stick to that structure.
Oh, there's a structure.
It was on the slide. Yeah. But the jolty, you can still get the marks through a jolty answer so long as you're doing 3 marks on one side, 3 marks on the other side. Yeah, theories can be used here. They went out of their way to say, your answer can actually be entirely theoretical in this section. They went out of their way to say that. Hence, I wanted us to work theories into it every time. You can write an entirely philosophical answer to this about relativism. We got lots of relativism answers that last year, and you could tell there were students who were doing philosophy, and they still got marks.
Will they give us a debate or do we get to choose?
We don't know. It could be either. That's why we need to be able to write about each of the debates.
Can you fix them up? So like, I know it's like,
obligation to strangers versus
No.
border security? Can you do obligation to strangers and something else?
No. Oh, you can if they don't give you one. Yes.
Yeah, but they don't give enough.
Yes, you can even use ethical debates that aren't on the study design. You can pick ones out of...
You make your own up.
Yeah. You can say one ethical debate around refugees is economic costs. That's not on our wall.
Or like, even if it's just completely, because like, yes, I didn't know what it was, so I kind of just like made it up.
You can still get them, but girls, the problem is if they do give you one from the course. Laura.
Let's just say, like, I know you probably wouldn't want to, like, but say with, like, I know the practices at military power, I couldn't really remember with Indonesia, and I was wondering if, because I'd done all my other answers on Indonesia, say I knew an example for another country that was listed as one of the South.
Yeah.
Can you do, or do they all have to be about the one you picked?
So we're going to go over the whole practice exam you did. It's a really good question, and my answer is that I want you all to stick to Indonesia for everything.
Like if you could go in the exam.
This is going to sound weird, but the first sentence at the top of the page says use one country from these 5 only. Now, when we sat in the room and did the assessment, no one pointed that out. So in fact, you could actually mark students who would use different countries, China, then Australia, then Indonesia.
Yeah.
But they might change their mind and they'd be right to, because it clearly says at the top of that page, use only one country for all answers. Now, we've got more than enough Indonesia examples that I've written on lots of people's papers, just use Indonesia. So that whole 2-page spread about power in Asia Pacific is just Indonesia. Now it can be Indonesia and Australia doing schools, or Indonesia and the US doing Detachment 88, but it's Indonesia focused.
But yeah, do you spread focuses on Indonesia?
Yes, the focus is always on Indonesia for us.
In the booklet it says that like 2 of the national interests on the study design.
Yes.
Can you still use them?
You can, but again, it's going to depend on the question. If it simply says, what is one area of Indonesia's, of a country's national interest that has been threatened, you don't have to stick to ones in the study design. I'll explain when we do foreign policy instruments why I've done that. Yeah, I did add 2 things, which seem like they're more work, but they actually, they fill out everything else. International reputation or community and economic security. I added them.
What about me?
Alright. One more thing about ethical debates. As you can see over here, some of our ethical debates have just one word. So rights of refugees just has one thing. If that's the case, you're just doing 3 marks on the positive, why we should protect the rights of refugees, and then 3 marks on the other side of the argument, why we shouldn't protect the rights of refugees. So if they give you one which is just a one-word thing, like mechanisms of threat reduction, we haven't done it, but it's the same thing. Economic migrants. 3 marks, Anna, on why we want to encourage economic migration, why it's good that people come here and work. 3 marks on the threats of economic migrants. So if they just give you one thing, it's your job to show the 2 sides of that argument. Of course, if they give you one with 2, it's easy. 3 marks about resettlement, 3 marks about border security. So just be aware of that, that some of our ethical debates are singular. You need to show both sides of it. Some of them have 2 sides already, like security versus proliferation.
How can they ask us a specific debate though if there's 2 of the 4? Like, is that
What
will
they-
they add an extra
yeah.
page or what?
No, what they can do is actually say, respond to one of the following dot points.
Okay.
And they'll do 1 for human rights, 1 for,
Okay.
yeah. So they can ask you specifics. Yeah. Last year they didn't. The question you guys answered was just, it was just ethical debates, go. And people pick stuff from all over the place. I think they'll be far more specific this time. What have we got? A couple more minutes?
The only thing I'm happy about is about foreign policy.
Alright. I think this is the second last slide. We've just got a couple of minutes.
Last year, like no time.
Compare and contrast. 2 ways to do this. And I strongly encourage you to get this PowerPoint and go over it in more detail. 2 ways to do a compare and contrast. 3 marks on one actor's response. You say what they did, you elaborate, you give detail. 3 marks on the other one, and when you're talking about the second one, that's when you're doing similarities and differences. So you can see at the bottom here, similarities and differences. There's no perfect response here. I'm just giving you a couple of options. So I would do 3 marks on what the US did in Iraq, 3 marks on what the UN did in Iraq, and here I would point out why their response is similar and or different at the bottom. That's one way to do it. 3 and 3. The next one is broken up a little bit differently. What did the US do? What did the UN do? Similarities, differences. This might look simpler to you. You want to go with that. That's fine too. So long as you're clear that you're comparing 2 responses. Now, last year when we were assessing, they didn't go into detail about how much actual comparing between the 2 needed to be done. All they said was that you needed to cover 2 different responses. So when I was assessing, so long as they said 3 marks about one, 3 marks about the other, it didn't matter that they hadn't directly compared the 2. But
that would just be like 2 different answers.
yeah. But let's try and highlight some of the ways that the responses are similar. They're both trying to deal with the crisis in Iraq. They both tried to resolve it. There aren't a lot of similarities. Differences, one used violence, one used soft power, etc., etc. We're not doing that. Little things, hang on. Capital letters on proper nouns. Capital letters. Full names. If it's the first time you're using it, especially in an essay, use the full name. After that, just call it the Refugee Convention. Don't write down the margins. Melissa, you're terrible at this. You've got to stop it. But so are other people. Once you've used all the space, you can actually use one extra full line under the line. But after that, just move to the extra space at the back. Don't write down the margins.
What if there's like room on the paper?
If there's room on the paper, you can keep going down. Yes, some of them have half page. Keep going down. That makes sense. Yes. But don't write down the side margins. Hang on. No waffle intros. I'm sick of them. Last 2 things, yes. Hang on, 30 seconds. Other teachers always keep you back. I'm trying to say. No waffle intros. Answer the question. And the last one is dates. If you use them, they must be correct. If you give the best answer of all time with an incorrect date, the whole answer is wrong. Then don't use dates. Because I'm sitting there with the internet when I'm marking. I've got the laptop next to me when I'm assessing. Yeah. If someone says Sudan invaded Ethiopia in 2004, I go, Sudan, Ethiopia, Wikipedia. Go. See you tomorrow. Keep working through this. We're doing global actors tomorrow. Oh.